The condensation on the water glass trembled as 6-year-old Emma Grace Sullivan traced the same 3 letters over and over again. SOS. Her strawberry blonde hair fell like a curtain across her face as she worked, small fingers moving with desperate precision while humming "Jesus Loves Me" in barely audible whispers. Across the cracked vinyl booth at Desert Rose Rest Stop, a man in a faded baseball cap never looked up from his newspaper. The silence between them stretched thick and wrong, broken only by the wheeze of an ancient air conditioner and the distant rumble of 18-wheelers on Highway 40. Former Army Sergeant Michael "Mick" Harrison noticed the pattern from his corner table. 20 years of military service had taught him to recognize distress signals, and this little girl was screaming for help without making a sound. When Emma's green eyes met his for one desperate heartbeat, Mick's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. The man's head snapped up sharply. "Emma, stop that noise!" Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Emma Grace Sullivan sat perfectly still, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized booth. At 6 years old, she possessed an unsettling wisdom that came from witnessing too much pain in too short a life. Her strawberry blonde hair caught the harsh fluorescent light of the Rest Stop diner, and her green eyes held depths that no child should carry. She was small for her age, fragile-looking, but there was steel beneath her quiet exterior, a resilience forged by tragedy and loss. 6 months ago, Emma's world had shattered when her mother, Rebecca "Becky" Sullivan, succumbed to a heroin overdose in their cramped Phoenix apartment. The needle was still in Becky's arm when Emma found her after walking home from kindergarten. Since then, Emma had lived with her maternal grandfather, Frank Sullivan, in his rundown trailer outside Flagstaff. She read at a 4th-grade level, far beyond her years, and had memorized dozens of Bible verses from the Sunday school she attended religiously. It was there she'd learned that Jesus loved all the little children, and soldiers were protectors sent by God. Frank Sullivan, 67, and weathered by decades of factory work and poor choices, sat across from her now. His Vietnam veteran baseball cap cast shadows over eyes that had once been kind but now darted nervously around the diner. Frank's massive gambling debts to loan sharks had pushed him beyond desperation into a darkness he never imagined possible. The medical bills from his late wife's cancer treatment had drained every penny, and the men who came to his trailer spoke of solutions that made his stomach turn. 30 feet away, Michael "Mick" Harrison nursed his coffee and tried to quiet the voices in his head. At 38, the former Army sergeant carried invisible wounds that ran deeper than the visible scars on his hands. 20 years of military service had ended abruptly when an IED explosion in Afghanistan killed his entire unit, leaving him the sole survivor. The Purple Heart in his duffel bag felt more like a weight than an honor. His own daughter, Sarah, had been 7 when his ex-wife won full custody during his 3rd deployment. He hadn't seen her in 2 years. Mick was driving cross-country to his sister's ranch in Texas, everything he owned packed in his battered pickup truck. His disability checks barely covered gas and cheap motels, but the open road offered something his cramped VA apartment never could: escape from the memories that stalked him in familiar places. His PTSD medication was running low, and the familiar edge of paranoia was creeping back into his thoughts. Dorothy Mae Henderson, the 65-year-old waitress, had worked truck stops and diners for 3 decades. A grandmother of 12, she'd developed an instinct for reading people, especially those carrying hidden pain. Something about the man and little girl in booth 7 had been bothering her all afternoon. The child barely touched her grilled cheese, and the man kept checking 2 different phones with the nervous energy of someone expecting bad news. The afternoon desert heat shimmered outside, but inside the diner a different kind of tension was building. The first sign something was wrong came when Frank Sullivan's phone buzzed for the third time in 10 minutes. Each notification made him flinch, and his weathered hands trembled as he checked the screen. Emma watched her grandfather with growing unease, her small fingers continuing their desperate pattern in the condensation of her water glass. SOS. Over and over again, as if repetition might somehow make the signal reach the right person. Mick Harrison had been watching the pair for nearly an hour now, his military training making him hyper-aware of behavioral anomalies. The little girl's body language screamed distress, shoulders hunched, eyes darting between her companion and potential exits, the unconscious way she kept one hand near her small pink backpack as if ready to grab it and run. But it was her methodical tracing of those 3 letters that made his pulse quicken. He'd taught that same signal to Afghan children in dangerous territories, a silent way to call for help when speaking could mean death. Frank's phone rang, and this time he answered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Yeah, I know. Yes, she's ready. Look, Miguel, I told you 6 o'clock, not before." He glanced around the diner nervously, then stepped outside, leaving Emma alone at the table. The moment Frank disappeared through the glass doors, Emma's composure cracked. Her green eyes found Mick's across the diner, and she mouthed a single word. "Help." Then she pointed toward the restroom, her message clear. She needed to talk, away from Frank's watchful eyes. Dorothy May had been refilling coffee cups, but she'd caught the exchange. 30 years of working truck stops had shown her the dark underbelly of American highways, the human trafficking, the desperate people, the children who disappeared without a trace. She'd lost her own granddaughter to such monsters 10 years ago, and the guilt of not speaking up when she'd had suspicions still ate at her every day. "That child's in trouble," Dorothy whispered to Mick as she approached his table. "I've seen it before. The way she sits, like she's afraid to move wrong. And that man, he's not acting like any grandfather I know." Mick nodded grimly. "I'm going to find out what's happening." When Emma slipped away to the restroom, Mick followed at a discreet distance. The hallway was dimly lit and smelled of industrial disinfectant, but it provided the privacy they needed. Emma was waiting by the paper towel dispenser, her small hands shaking as she pulled drawings from her backpack. "Are you really a soldier?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mama always said soldiers protect people." "Yes, sweetheart. What's your name?" "Emma Grace Sullivan." "My mama went to heaven 6 months ago." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back with the practiced control of a child who'd learned that crying often made things worse. "Grandpa Frank says we're going to Mexico to see her, but I know Mama's in heaven, not Mexico." She showed him her drawings, crayon sketches that made Mick's blood run cold. Dark rooms filled with crying children, men with scary faces counting money. A little girl who looked like Emma locked behind bars. In one drawing, a figure in a military uniform was reaching toward the imprisoned girl. "Grandpa's friends are coming to get me today," Emma continued, her voice matter-of-fact in the way children discuss nightmares. "He said if I'm good and don't make trouble, the bad men won't hurt him. He owes them money because Grandma got sick." Mick knelt to her level, his heart breaking. "Emma, listen to me carefully. What your grandfather is planning, it's not right. Those men aren't going to take you to your mama. They're going to hurt you." Emma's lip trembled. "I know. But Grandpa Frank is scared of them. He cries at night when he thinks I'm sleeping. He says this is the only way to save both of us." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both freeze. Frank's voice echoed off the walls. "Emma? Where are you, honey?" "I have to go," Emma whispered urgently. She pressed something into Mick's hand, a folded piece of paper. "I drew this for you." When Mick unfolded it later, He found a picture of himself in military uniform, standing protectively over a small girl with blonde hair. At the bottom, in careful first-grade handwriting, she'd written, "Please help me get to Jesus." Frank appeared in the hallway, his face dark with suspicion. "What's going on here, Emma? I told you not to talk to strangers." "Sorry, Grandpa," Emma said quietly, slipping her hand into Frank's. "I just needed the bathroom." Frank's grip on her hand was too tight, Mick noticed. Possessive, controlling. "We need to get going, sweetheart. Our friends are waiting." As they walked back toward the dining area, Mick caught Frank's muttered words. "Damn kid needs to learn to keep her mouth shut." Back at their table, Frank's agitation was obvious. He kept checking his phones. Mick now realized there were two, the regular one and a burner phone for his criminal contacts. A text message on the burner made Frank's face go pale. "ETA 30 minutes. Have package ready for immediate transport. Payment on delivery." Emma sat rigidly beside her grandfather, no longer tracing letters in the condensation. Instead, she'd begun humming "Jesus Loves Me" under her breath, a coping mechanism that seemed to calm her nerves, but her eyes kept finding Mick's, silently pleading for the help she'd asked for. Dorothy May approached their table with practiced casualness. "Can I get you folks anything else? Some pie for the little miss?" "We're fine," Frank said curtly. "Just the check." "You sure? We've got fresh apple pie, still warm." Most kids love it. Dorothy's grandmother instincts were in full force, trying to delay their departure. Emma looked up hopefully. "Can I have some pie, Grandpa Frank, please?" Frank's jaw tightened. "I said we're leaving. Get your things." That's when Mick made his decision. 20 years of military service had taught him that sometimes you had to act on incomplete intelligence. Sometimes saving one life was worth the risk. He stood up and walked over to their table, his mind racing through possible approaches. "Excuse me," he said to Frank, keeping his voice conversational. "I couldn't help but notice your veteran cap. I'm Army myself, just got out. Always like meeting fellow servicemen." Frank looked suspicious, but couldn't ignore the military courtesy. "Vietnam, 1st Infantry." "You?" "Afghanistan, multiple tours. Your granddaughter here reminds me of my own daughter." Mick smiled at Emma, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. "You two heading somewhere special?" "Family business," Frank said shortly, standing up. "Come on, Emma." But Emma had found her courage. Looking directly at Mick, she said loudly enough for other diners to hear, "Grandpa says we're going to see Mama in Mexico, but Mama's in heaven. Why would Mama be in Mexico?" The innocent question hung in the air like an accusation. Frank's face flushed red, and several other patrons turned to look. Dorothy May stopped pretending to clean tables and moved closer. "Kids say the darndest things," Frank laughed nervously. "She gets confused sometimes. Her mother is visiting family in Mexico." But Mick saw the lie for what it was, and more importantly, he saw Emma's terrified expression. The little girl was giving him one last chance to save her, using the only weapon she had, the truth spoken in a child's innocent voice. The moment of decision had arrived. The moment Frank Sullivan stepped outside to take his phone call, Emma's carefully constructed facade of obedience crumbled. Her small fingers, which had been methodically tracing SOS in the condensation of her water glass, now moved with desperate urgency. She looked directly at Mick across the diner, her blue eyes wide with a terror that no 6-year-old should ever have to carry, and mouthed a single word that hit him like a physical blow: "Help." Mick's military training kicked into overdrive. 20 years of reading situations, of distinguishing between normal childhood distress and genuine life-threatening danger, told him that this little girl was in immediate peril. When Emma pointed toward the restroom, indicating she needed to speak privately, every instinct screamed that time was running out. He waited exactly 30 seconds after she disappeared down the hallway before following, his combat boots silent on the worn linoleum floor. The restroom hallway was dimly lit and smelled of industrial disinfectant, but it provided the privacy they desperately needed. Emma was waiting by the paper towel dispenser, her small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. When she saw Mick, her carefully controlled composure finally broke, and the words came tumbling out in the breathless rush of a child who had been holding secrets that were too big for her to carry alone. "Are you really a soldier?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "Mama always said soldiers protect people." "Yes, sweetheart. I'm a soldier. What's your name?" "Emma Grace Sullivan. My mama went to heaven 6 months ago." The matter-of-fact way she delivered this devastating information broke something inside Mick's chest. He knelt to her level, his face gentle but alert, as Emma continued with the brutal honesty that only traumatized children possess. "Grandpa Frank says we're going to Mexico to see her, but I know Mama's in heaven, not Mexico. Sunday school taught me that." With hands that shook despite her efforts to be brave, Emma pulled a folded piece of paper from her pink backpack. It was a crayon drawing that made Mick's blood run cold, a picture of herself standing behind bars while scary men with angry faces counted money. In another corner of the paper, she had drawn what was unmistakably a little girl crying in a dark room surrounded by other children who looked just as frightened. "Grandpa's friends are coming to get me today," Emma continued, her voice taking on the eerie calm of a child who had been forced to accept the unacceptable. "He said, if I'm good and don't make trouble, the bad men won't hurt him. He owes them money because Grandma got sick and the hospital took all our money." She looked up at Mick with eyes that held far too much understanding. "But I know they're not really going to take care of me. They're going to hurt me like they hurt other kids." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both freeze. Frank's voice echoed off the walls, sharp with suspicion and growing panic. "Emma, where are you, honey? We need to go, now." Emma's face went white with terror, but she pressed one more drawing into Mick's hands before Frank appeared in the hallway. This one showed a man in military uniform, clearly meant to be Mick, standing protectively over a small girl with blonde hair. At the bottom, in careful, first-grade handwriting, she had written, "Please help me get to Jesus." Frank's appearance in the doorway was like a thunderclap. His weathered face was flushed with anxiety and anger, his gray-blue eyes darting between Emma and Mick with the paranoid intensity of a man whose carefully laid plans were starting to unravel. "What's going on here?" "Emma, I told you not to talk to strangers." "I was just asking for directions to the highway," Mick said smoothly, his military training allowing him to lie with convincing calm while his mind raced through tactical options. "Your granddaughter was very polite." But Frank wasn't buying it. His grip on Emma's hand was possessive, controlling, and Mick noticed how the little girl's shoulders tensed at his touch. "We need to leave. Right now," Frank said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that confirmed every one of Mick's worst suspicions. As they walked back toward the dining area, Mick caught the muttered words that Frank thought no one could hear. "Damn kid needs to learn to keep her mouth shut." The phrase hit Mick like a slap, confirming that Emma's fear was not only justified, but probably understated. Back at their table, Frank's agitation was impossible to hide. He kept checking both of his phones, the regular one and what Mick now recognized as a burner phone for his criminal contacts. A text message on the burner made Frank's face go ashen. "ETA 20 minutes. Have package ready for immediate transport. Payment on delivery as agreed." Dorothy May approached their table with the practiced casualness of someone who had spent 30 years reading the emotional temperature of her customers. "Can I get you folks anything else? Some pie for the little miss? We've got fresh apple pie, still warm from the oven." "We're fine," Frank said curtly, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Just the check. We need to leave." Emma looked up hopefully, perhaps seeing one last chance for normalcy before her world changed forever. "Can I have some pie, Grandpa Frank, please? Just a little piece?" Frank's jaw tightened dangerously. "I said we're leaving. Get your things." "Now." The harshness in his voice made several other diners look over with concern. Emma's face fell, and she began humming "Jesus Loves Me" under her breath, a coping mechanism that Mick recognized as a child's way of self-soothing in the face of overwhelming fear. That's when Mick made his decision. 20 years of military service had taught him that sometimes you had to act on incomplete intelligence, that sometimes saving one life was worth the risk of being wrong. But in this case, he wasn't wrong. Every detail, Emma's drawings, her whispered confessions, Frank's suspicious behavior, the burner phone, the obvious fear in the child's eyes, painted a picture that was crystal clear to anyone trained to recognize human trafficking. He stood up and walked over to their table, his mind already formulating a plan. He needed to buy time, needed to keep them here until law enforcement could arrive, needed to protect Emma without escalating the situation to violence in a public place filled with innocent bystanders. "Excuse me," he said to Frank, keeping his voice conversational but letting a hint of his military bearing show through. "I couldn't help but notice your veteran cap. I'm Army myself, just got out after 20 years. Always like meeting fellow servicemen." Frank looked suspicious but couldn't ignore the military courtesy without seeming rude. "Vietnam, 1st Infantry Division. You?" "Afghanistan, multiple tours with the 82nd Airborne. Your granddaughter here reminds me of my own daughter back home." Mick smiled at Emma, who was watching the exchange with wide, hopeful eyes. "You two heading somewhere special today?" "Family business," Frank said, shortly, standing up and reaching for Emma's hand. "Come on, sweetheart." Time to go. But Emma had found her voice, perhaps inspired by Mick's presence or perhaps driven by the desperation of knowing this might be her last chance. Looking directly at Mick, she said loudly enough for other diners to hear, "Grandpa says we're going to see Mama in Mexico, but Mama's in heaven. Why would Mama be in Mexico when she went to heaven 6 months ago?" The innocent question hung in the air like an accusation. Frank's face flushed red with embarrassment and panic as several other patrons turned to look at their table. The logical inconsistency of a dead mother being in Mexico was obvious to everyone within earshot. "Kids say the darndest things," Frank laughed nervously, his voice cracking with strain. "She gets confused sometimes. Her mother is visiting family in Mexico. She'll understand when she's older." But Mick saw the lie for what it was, and more importantly, he saw Emma's terrified expression as her grandfather's grip on her wrist tightened until his knuckles went white. The little girl was giving him one last chance to save her, using the only weapon she had, the truth spoken in a child's innocent voice. Dorothy May, who had been hovering nearby with growing concern, caught Mick's eye and nodded slightly. She had seen enough in her 30 years of serving truck drivers and highway travelers to recognize when a situation was about to go very, very wrong. The moment of decision had arrived, and there was no turning back. The tension in Margaret's diner reached a breaking point when Frank's burner phone rang with a shrill electronic tone that cut through the afternoon quiet like a knife. Frank's face went white as he glanced at the caller ID, then at Emma, then at the growing number of concerned faces turned in their direction. His weathered hands shook as he answered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried more clearly than he intended in the suddenly silent diner. "Yeah, Miguel. I know you're early. No, there's a problem here. Some soldier boy is asking questions." Frank's eyes darted nervously to Mick, who was standing beside their table with the relaxed alertness of a man trained for combat. "Give me 10 minutes to sort this out." Emma's small hand crept across the table toward the salt shaker, and Mick watched with growing alarm as she began spelling out letters in the scattered crystals. SOS. Then, with heartbreaking precision, she spelled out, "Help me," in tiny white granules, her blue eyes fixed on Mick's face with desperate hope. Dorothy May, who had been pretending to wipe down nearby tables while eavesdropping, couldn't stand by any longer. 30 years of serving travelers had given her an instinct for recognizing predators, and everything about this situation screamed danger. She walked directly to Mick's side, coffee pot in hand as a prop, and spoke in a voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Sir, is everything all right over here? The little girl looks upset." Frank's response was immediate and telling. Instead of the natural reaction of a loving grandfather reassuring his granddaughter, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We're fine. Mind your own business. Emma, get your bag. We're leaving right now." But Emma didn't move. For the first time in months, she had found adults who seemed willing to listen, to see her distress signals, to treat her like more than a commodity to be moved from place to place. Her small voice, barely above a whisper but clear in the sudden quiet, carried across the diner like a bell. "I don't want to go with the scary men, Grandpa Frank. Please don't make me go." The words hit the diner like a physical blow. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The elderly couple by the window looked up from their newspapers. Even little Leo, who had been running around with his toy car, stopped playing and stared at Emma with the instinctive understanding that children have when another child is in real trouble. Frank's mask of grandfatherly concern finally slipped completely. His face contorted with a mixture of rage, panic, and desperation as he reached for Emma's wrist with enough force to leave marks. "You don't know what you're talking about. These people are going to help us. Now move." That's when Mick stepped between Frank and Emma, his movement smooth and purposeful. 20 years of military training had taught him to read escalating situations, and this one was about to explode into violence. His voice was calm but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Sir, I think you need to take a step back. The child is clearly distressed, and forcing her to leave against her will isn't appropriate." Frank's response revealed the desperation that had driven him to this point. "You don't understand. They'll kill me if I don't deliver her. I owe these people money, more money than I can ever pay back. This is the only way. She'll be better off with them than dead with me." The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Every person in the diner now understood exactly what was happening. A grandfather so desperate to pay gambling debts that he was willing to sell his own granddaughter to human traffickers. The moral complexity of Frank's situation didn't diminish the horror of his intended solution. Dorothy May was already moving toward the phone behind the counter, but Frank's next words stopped her cold. "Don't even think about calling the police. The local sheriff is bought and paid for. You call the cops, and all you're doing is giving my contacts more time to disappear with the kid." Mick's military mind immediately processed this information. If local law enforcement was compromised, they needed federal intervention, FBI, state police, someone outside the local corruption network, but that would take time they didn't have. The traffickers were already en route, probably no more than 15 minutes away. Emma, perhaps sensing that this was her last chance to speak freely, stood up on her chair so everyone could see her clearly. In a voice that carried the shocking wisdom of a child forced to grow up too fast, she addressed the entire diner. "My name is Emma Grace Sullivan, and I'm 6 years old. My mama, Rebecca, went to heaven 6 months ago from drugs. Grandpa Frank owes bad men money, and they said they'll take me to Mexico to pay his debt. But I know they're not really going to take care of me. I've heard Grandpa crying at night when he talks to them on the phone." The simple, devastating honesty of her words galvanized everyone present. This wasn't a domestic dispute or a family misunderstanding. This was a child trafficking operation unfolding in broad daylight in a small-town diner, and ordinary citizens were being called upon to become heroes. Big Jim Thompson, the truck driver who had been eating quietly in the corner, stood up to his full 6'4" height. His weathered face was set with the kind of righteous anger that comes from a lifetime of seeing injustice and finally having a chance to stop it. "Well, I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and watch a little girl get sold to perverts." Margaret Chen, the elderly woman who had been reading with her husband, surprised everyone by pulling out a smartphone and beginning to record video. "I'm live streaming this to Facebook," she announced in a voice that brooked no argument. "Let's see these traffickers try to operate when the whole world is watching." Frank's desperation reached a crescendo. He lunged toward Emma, but Mick was ready for him. Years of close-quarters combat training allowed him to intercept Frank's grab without hurting the older man, simply redirecting his momentum and placing himself firmly between the grandfather and his intended victim. "This isn't going to happen," Mick said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of finality that comes from someone who has made peace with dying for a principle. "I don't care about your debts. I don't care about your threats, and I don't care if the local cops are corrupt. This child is under my protection now." Emma, who had been watching this confrontation with the wide-eyed fascination of a child seeing adults finally do the right thing, suddenly ran to Mick and wrapped her small arms around his waist. The gesture was so natural, so trusting, that it brought tears to Dorothy May's eyes. "You're my soldier now," Emma whispered against Mick's shirt. "Mama said soldiers protect people who can't protect themselves." Frank's phone rang again, the regular one this time. When he answered, his face went even whiter than before. "What do you mean you can see the diner? You're here already?" He looked toward the windows and saw the black SUV with tinted windows pulling into the parking lot. "No, everything's fine. Just give me 2 more minutes." But everything was not fine. Dorothy May had managed to reach the state police on her cell phone, giving them the diner's location and a description of the trafficking operation in progress. Margaret Chen's Facebook Live video was already being shared by dozens of viewers, creating a digital paper trail that would be impossible for corrupt local officials to suppress. And Big Jim Thompson had positioned his massive frame near the door, making it clear that nobody was leaving with Emma without going through him first. The black SUV in the parking lot sat idling, its occupants no doubt wondering why a simple pickup was taking so long. Through the tinted windows, Mick could make out at least 3 figures, and he was certain they were armed. The next few minutes would determine whether Emma lived to see her 7th birthday or disappeared forever into a nightmare that claimed thousands of children every year. Frank made one last desperate plea to the room. "You people don't understand what you're interfering with. These aren't local criminals. This is an international organization. They have resources, connections, ways of making problems disappear. Help me get her out of here, and maybe they'll let the rest of you live." Emma's response to her grandfather's threat was to squeeze Mick's waist tighter and look up at him with absolute trust. "Are you going to let them take me?" Mick looked down at the little girl who had somehow become the most important thing in his world and made a promise that would change both their lives forever. "Not while I'm breathing, sweetheart. Not while I'm breathing." Outside, car doors slammed as the traffickers grew impatient with the delay. The pre-dawn darkness at the Sunset Motel was shattered by the sound of splintering wood as Mick kicked in the door to room 237. His military training had taken over completely. 20 years of combat experience condensed into pure, focused action. Inside, chaos erupted immediately. 3 men in expensive suits spun around, hands reaching for concealed weapons, while Frank Sullivan stood frozen in the center of the room, his face a mask of terror and regret. "Emma, get down!" Mick shouted, but the 6-year-old was already moving, her small body diving behind the bathroom door where she'd learned to hide during the worst of her grandfather's meetings with these men. Her survival instincts, honed by months of living in fear, kicked in with heartbreaking precision. The first gunshot came from Miguel Santos, the operations leader, a thin man with cold eyes who'd made his fortune selling children across international borders. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Mick's head, but he was already rolling, using furniture for cover while scanning for Emma's location. His Purple Heart hadn't been earned sitting behind a desk. He'd survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by thinking faster and moving quicker than the enemy. "You made a big mistake, soldier boy," Miguel snarled, his accent thick with menace. "This is business. You just cost a lot of people a lot of money." But Frank Sullivan, seeing the terror in his granddaughter's eyes as she cowered in the bathroom doorway, finally found his backbone. 67 years old and dying inside from what he'd almost done, he lunged at Miguel's gun hand. "I changed my mind. The deal's off. You can't have her." The second gunshot was muffled against Frank's chest as Miguel's weapon discharged at point-blank range. Emma's scream cut through the air like a blade, raw and desperate as she watched her grandfather, the only family she had left, crumple to the stained motel carpet. "Grandpa Frank!" Emma bolted from her hiding place, her small hands trying desperately to stop the blood flowing from Frank's chest. "Grandpa, please don't leave me. Please don't go to heaven, too." Mick used Emma's diversion to close the distance with Miguel's 2 associates. His combat knife, carried since his first deployment, found the kidney of the nearest man, while his free hand disarmed the second with a brutal twist that snapped bone. But Miguel still had his weapon trained on Emma, using the dying Frank as a human shield. "Back off, hero, or the kid dies right now," Miguel threatened, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "You think you're saving her? You just signed her death warrant. Without Grandpa's consent, she becomes evidence." Dead evidence. Outside, the sound of Dorothy May's horn blared in 3 long bursts, the agreed signal that police were approaching. But Miguel's organization had survived by having contingency plans. Through the motel window, Mick could see a black SUV pulling into the parking lot, its engine running, back doors already open. "Time's up, soldier boy. You get to choose. Try to be a hero and watch this little girl die, or walk away and let us handle our business professionally." Emma, still pressing her small hands against Frank's chest wound, looked up at Mick with eyes that held too much understanding. "It's okay, Mr. Soldier," she whispered, her voice trembling but determined. "Jesus will take care of me. Mama told me so." The faith of a 6-year-old child in the face of ultimate evil broke something inside Mick's chest. This little girl was prepared to die rather than cause him harm, ready to sacrifice herself just as his daughter Sarah might have done. The parallel was too painful, too perfect, too impossible to ignore. But Emma wasn't done fighting. With the quick thinking that had kept her alive through months of danger, she remembered the lessons from the fire safety program at her school. The bathroom had a small window that opened onto the motel's back alley, too small for adults but just right for a determined 6-year-old. "I know another way out," she whispered to Mick, while pretending to comfort her dying grandfather. "The window in the bathroom. I've been practicing." Frank, blood frothing at his lips, grabbed Miguel's ankle with his last strength. "Emma, run!" he gasped. Tell them I'm sorry." Miguel kicked Frank's hand away and raised his weapon toward Emma, but Mick was already moving. Years of close-quarters combat training compressed into a single moment of perfect violence. His shoulder caught Miguel in the midsection, driving both men through the flimsy motel room wall and into the adjacent bathroom. "Now, Emma! Go now!" The little girl scrambled toward the bathroom window, her small fingers working frantically at the latch while the 2 men crashed through shower fixtures and plaster. Behind her, Frank Sullivan drew his last breath, his eyes fixed on his granddaughter's escape route. Emma squeezed through the window just as the black SUV's occupants stormed through the front door, but instead of finding an easy pickup, they walked into a war zone where a trained soldier was fighting for the life of a child who'd become his reason to live. The third gunshot came from Mick's own weapon, Frank's old service pistol that the dying man had pressed into his hands. The bullet caught Miguel in the shoulder, spinning him around and giving Mick the opening he needed to reach the window. But as he tried to follow Emma's escape route, pain exploded through his left leg. One of the SUV's occupants had flanked around the building, and his shot had found its mark. Mick crashed to the bathroom floor, blood streaming from the wound, while Emma's voice called to him from the alley. "Mr. Soldier, are you okay? Are you coming?" Through gritted teeth, Mick managed to push himself toward the window. Outside, he could hear Dorothy May's truck engine roaring as she positioned her vehicle between the alley and the black SUV. Big Jim Thompson's 18-wheeler was jackknifing across the motel's main exit, trapping the traffickers' vehicles in the parking lot. But the most beautiful sound was the approaching wail of state police sirens, real law enforcement, not the corrupt local deputies who'd been bought and paid for. Dorothy's call to her nephew in the state police had finally brought honest cops to the scene. Emma appeared at the bathroom window, her small face streaked with tears and dirt, but alive and free. "Can you climb out, Mr. Soldier? Dorothy says the good policemen are almost here." Mick hauled himself through the window, his wounded leg screaming in protest, but his heart soaring with something he hadn't felt since Afghanistan, the knowledge that he'd completed his mission. Emma was safe. The little girl who'd trusted him with her life was alive and free. As they stumbled together toward Dorothy's truck, Emma slipped her small hand into his bloodied one. "Thank you for being my soldier," she whispered. "I knew Jesus would send someone to protect me." Behind them, the motel erupted in the controlled chaos of a law enforcement operation. Miguel and his associates were surrounded, their human trafficking network about to be exposed and destroyed. Frank Sullivan's body lay still in room 237, but his final act of defiance had saved his granddaughter's life. Mick squeezed Emma's hand gently as Dorothy helped them both into her truck. For the first time since losing his unit in Afghanistan, he felt like he'd truly won a battle. The war against evil was far from over, but today, one innocent child would go home safe. The climax was over, but Mick knew their story was just beginning. The sterile white walls of Phoenix Children's Hospital seemed to close in around Emma as she sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her small legs dangling above the floor. 3 days had passed since the shooting at the Sunset Motel, and the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in with the crushing weight that only complete abandonment can bring. Frank Sullivan was dead, the only family she had left in the world. The grandfather who had loved her, protected her, fed her, and ultimately tried to sell her to monsters, was gone, and she was utterly alone. Mick lay in the ICU 2 floors above, his leg shattered by the trafficker's bullet, his body fighting off infection, and his mind battling the demons that the rescue had awakened. The doctors said he would recover, but Emma wasn't allowed to see him. She was a ward of the state now, and wards of the state didn't get to choose who they considered family. The social worker, a tired woman named Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, who carried a caseload of 47 children, had explained it to Emma in the gentle but firm voice reserved for delivering life-altering news to 6-year-olds. "Sweetheart, Mr. Harrison isn't a relative, and he's very sick right now. We need to find you a proper home with a nice family who can take care of you." But Emma didn't want a nice family. She wanted her soldier, the man who had risked his life to save her, who had kept his promise to protect her, who had looked at her with the same love she remembered seeing in her mother's eyes before the drugs took that love away. She wanted the man who understood what it meant to be broken and still choose to fight. The first foster placement lasted exactly 18 hours. The Williamson family lived in a spotless suburban home with a perfectly manicured lawn and 3 biological children who stared at Emma like she was a curiosity from another planet. Mrs. Williamson was kind but overwhelmed, and when Emma woke up screaming from nightmares about her grandfather's death, when she refused to eat anything except saltine crackers, when she spent hours drawing pictures of soldiers and little girls instead of playing with the donated toys, it became clear that this wasn't going to work. "She needs specialized care," Mrs. Williamson told Patricia Hendricks apologetically. "We're just not equipped to handle this level of trauma." The second placement was with an older couple, the Garcias, who had fostered dozens of children over the years. They were patient and understanding, but Emma had stopped talking entirely. She would sit by their kitchen window for hours, watching the street for Mick's truck, convinced that he would come for her as soon as he was better. When Mrs. Garcia gently tried to explain that Mick was in the hospital and couldn't visit, Emma simply shook her head and continued her vigil. At night she would whisper prayers to her mother and Jesus, begging them to bring her soldier back. "Mama, you said soldiers protect people. Why won't they let my soldier protect me?" The Garcias' hearts broke, listening to her quiet sobs through the bedroom wall. But after 2 weeks of Emma refusing to engage with their family, refusing to go to school, refusing to accept that this was her new life, they had to make the difficult call. "She's not bonding with us," Mr. Garcia explained to the social worker. "She keeps asking for someone named Mick. She draws pictures of him constantly. I think she's formed an attachment to this man that's preventing her from accepting placement." Meanwhile, 3 floors above in the ICU, Mick was fighting his own battle. The physical injuries were healing slowly. The bullet had shattered his femur and required multiple surgeries to repair. But the emotional trauma was far worse. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's face in that motel bathroom, heard her voice calling him Mr. Soldier, remembered the trust in her green eyes as she put her life in his hands. She had become his reason for surviving, his proof that he could still protect innocent people, his path to redemption from the guilt that had consumed him since Afghanistan. But the legal system was a different kind of battlefield, one where his military training was useless. His disability status, his PTSD diagnosis, his lack of stable housing, everything that made him understand Emma's pain also made him unsuitable as a guardian in the eyes of Child Protective Services. His requests to visit her were denied. His calls to her social worker went unreturned. The system that was supposed to protect her was keeping them apart. Dorothy May became his only connection to Emma's situation, visiting the hospital daily and providing updates that grew more heartbreaking with each visit. "She's not talking, honey," Dorothy would report, her weathered face creased with worry. "That sweet child has just shut down. She keeps asking for you, drawing pictures of you, waiting for you to come get her. It's breaking everyone's heart." The third foster placement was emergency only, a group home for difficult cases, where Emma was housed with 7 other children who had been failed by the system in various ways. The staff was overworked and understaffed, dealing with behavioral problems, runaway attempts, and the daily chaos of managing traumatized children. Emma, who had been quiet and withdrawn in her previous placements, began to exhibit new symptoms of trauma. She stopped eating almost entirely, surviving on juice boxes and animal crackers when the staff could coax her to consume anything. She regressed in her toilet training, something that hadn't happened since she was 3 years old. Most heartbreaking of all, she stopped drawing her pictures of soldiers and little girls. The art therapy sessions that had been her only form of communication since the shooting yielded nothing but blank pages and silent tears. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the child psychologist assigned to Emma's case, had seen many traumatized children in her 15 years of practice, but Emma's case was particularly devastating. "She's formed what we call a trauma bond with Mr. Harrison," she explained to Patricia Hendricks during their weekly case review. He represents safety and protection to her in a way that no one else can. Separating them may be causing more psychological damage than the original trauma. But the bureaucratic machinery ground on, indifferent to the emotional needs of one small girl. Mick's applications for visitation were denied due to his lack of legal standing. His requests to begin the process of becoming a licensed foster parent were rejected due to his disability status and lack of traditional employment. The system was designed to protect children from unstable adults, but it couldn't distinguish between instability that posed a danger and instability that came from caring too much. Emma's 4th week in state custody brought the news that would shatter what little remained of her world. Patricia Hendricks, looking more tired than ever, sat across from Emma in the group home's tiny visiting room and delivered the update with as much gentleness as she could muster. "Sweetheart, we found a wonderful family for you. They live in California and they have a big house with a swimming pool and a dog named Charlie. They're very excited to meet you and give you a forever home." Emma's response was barely a whisper. "What about my soldier?" "Honey, Mr. Harrison is getting better, but he can't take care of you right now. The Rodriguez family in California can give you everything you need, your own room, good schools, a stable home." That night, Emma broke her silence in a way that brought the entire group home staff running. Her screams echoed through the corridors, raw and primal, the sound of a child whose last thread of hope had been severed. She threw herself against the locked bedroom door until her small shoulders were bruised, begging for her soldier, pleading to go home to a place that no longer existed. The tragedy was complete. A little girl who had survived human trafficking, who had found the courage to trust one more person, who had believed that good people still existed in the world, was being torn away from the only source of healing she had left. The system meant to protect her was destroying her, one well-intentioned decision at a time. The revelation came from the most unexpected source, a manila folder buried in Frank Sullivan's personal effects that the coroner's office had been holding for weeks. Dorothy May, acting as the closest thing Frank had to a friend in his final days, was going through his belongings when she discovered a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The return address made her blood run cold. Thomas Sullivan, Portland, Oregon. Frank's younger brother Thomas had been estranged from the family for over a decade, but these letters told a different story. Postmarked over the past 6 months, they detailed a correspondence that began shortly after Rebecca's death and escalated into something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Dorothy's hands shook as she read Thomas's carefully worded suggestions about Emma's future, his offers of financial assistance for Frank's mounting debts, and his repeated inquiries about the little girl's schedule, habits, and vulnerabilities. The final letter, dated just 2 weeks before the motel incident, was the most damning. "Frank, I understand your reluctance, but this is bigger than just paying off your debts. The organization I work with specializes in finding homes for children like Emma, children who need special care and attention. The compensation would solve all your problems, and Emma would be well provided for. Sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the greater good." Dorothy immediately called the state police, but Detective Ray Morrison, who had been investigating the trafficking ring, delivered shocking news that made the situation exponentially worse. "Ma'am, we've been tracking Thomas Sullivan for 3 years. He's not just connected to this trafficking network. He's one of their primary recruiters on the West Coast. We believe he's been using his legitimate business as a cover to identify vulnerable families and children." The implications hit Dorothy like a physical blow. "You mean Frank didn't just stumble into this? His own brother set him up?" "We think Thomas has been grooming Frank for months, maybe longer. The gambling debts, the medical bills, they were just pressure points. Thomas knew exactly which buttons to push to get Frank desperate enough to cooperate, And now, with Frank dead, Thomas is positioning himself as Emma's only living relative. The legal machinery was already in motion. Thomas Sullivan had hired expensive attorneys and filed for emergency custody of his beloved niece, presenting himself as a successful businessman who had been searching for Emma ever since learning of his brother's tragic death. His petition painted him as the grief-stricken uncle who wanted to provide a stable home for his orphaned niece, complete with character references from community leaders and financial statements proving his ability to provide for her. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Dr. Sarah Martinez, Emma's psychologist, had been conducting routine background checks on potential family placements when she uncovered a pattern that chilled her to the bone. 3 children previously placed with Thomas Sullivan through various legal channels had disappeared from his custody over the past 5 years. In each case, Thomas had reported them as runaways, and the overwhelmed Child Protective Services system had closed the cases without thorough investigation. "This isn't coincidence," Dr. Martinez told Detective Morrison during an emergency meeting at the hospital. "Thomas Sullivan is a predator who has been using the legal system to gain access to vulnerable children. He's been planning to get Emma from the beginning, and Frank was just a pawn in his game." Meanwhile, Mick was fighting his own battle from his hospital bed. His physical therapy sessions had become secondary to his desperate attempts to navigate the legal system and protect Emma. His sister in Texas had agreed to provide a character reference. His old commanding officer had written letters attesting to his moral character, and Dorothy May had organized a small army of supporters from the trucking community who had witnessed his heroic actions at the motel. But it was Emma herself who provided the most compelling evidence against Thomas Sullivan's custody bid. During what was supposed to be a supervised introduction meeting at the group home, Emma's reaction to her uncle was immediate and visceral. The moment Thomas walked into the room, a tall, well-dressed man with the same green eyes as Emma and her mother, the little girl began to hyperventilate. "No," she whispered, backing against the wall. "No, no, no. He was there. He was in Grandpa's dreams. The scary man in Grandpa's dreams." Thomas, maintaining his facade of concerned uncle, knelt down to Emma's level with practiced warmth. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm your Uncle Tommy. I've come to take you home to a wonderful new life." But Emma's trauma-honed instincts were screaming danger. She had heard Thomas's voice before, on the phone with Frank during those terrifying late-night conversations, making suggestions that made her grandfather cry. She had drawn pictures of the scary man who lived in her grandfather's nightmares, and now that man was standing in front of her, claiming to be family. "I want my soldier," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "I want Mick. I don't want to go with the scary man." The social worker present at the meeting, Patricia Hendricks, tried to calm the situation. "Emma, this is your uncle. He's family. He wants to give you a good home." But Emma's response shattered the carefully constructed illusion. Looking directly at Thomas with the unflinching honesty that only traumatized children possess, she said, "You're the one who made Grandpa Frank cry. You're the one who told him to give me to the bad men." Thomas's mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of cold calculation that replaced his warm smile, but it was enough for Dr. Martinez to catch. The psychologist immediately called for the meeting to be terminated and requested an emergency psychological evaluation of Emma's claims. The breakthrough came when Detective Morrison, armed with Dorothy's discovery and Dr. Martinez's observations, obtained a warrant to search Thomas Sullivan's Portland residence and business records. What they found was a sophisticated operation disguised as a legitimate import-export business. Financial records showed payments from known trafficking organizations, correspondence with criminals across multiple countries, and most damning of all, a detailed file on Emma Grace Sullivan that included photographs, school records, medical information, and a psychological profile dating back months before Frank's first contact with the traffickers. Thomas hadn't just been Frank's brother, he had been his handler, carefully manipulating Frank's desperation and guilt to deliver Emma into the hands of the trafficking network. The plan had been for Frank to hand Emma over to Thomas after the fake sale to the other traffickers, creating a paper trail that would make Thomas appear to be rescuing her from a bad situation rather than delivering her to an even worse one. But Mick's intervention had destroyed that careful plan, leaving Thomas to pursue legal custody as his backup strategy. The discovery of his true nature sent shockwaves through the Child Protective Services system and triggered a federal investigation into how many other children had been lost to Thomas's network over the years. Emma's reaction to learning the truth about her uncle was complicated by her love for the grandfather who had tried to save her in the end. Grandpa Frank didn't know, she insisted to Dr. Martinez during their therapy session. The scary man tricked Grandpa Frank. Grandpa Frank said he was sorry. Jesus forgives people who are sorry. The revelation that Thomas Sullivan was the real architect of Emma's trafficking had immediate legal implications. His custody petition was not only denied but became evidence in a federal case against him. More importantly, it cleared the way for Mick's own petition for custody to be reconsidered under emergency circumstances. The truth had finally emerged from the shadows, but it brought with it the horrifying knowledge of how close Emma had come to disappearing forever into a network that had been targeting her since birth. Her survival was due not just to Mick's heroism, but to her own incredible strength and the tragic last-minute redemption of a grandfather who had died trying to undo the worst mistake of his life. The system that had failed her so completely now scrambled to make amends, but the damage of separation had already been done. The question remained whether Emma and Mick could find their way back to each other after weeks of institutional trauma that had wounded them both in ways that might never fully heal. The Phoenix family court was unusually quiet on the morning of October 15th, a stark contrast to the media circus that had surrounded Emma's case for the past month. Judge Margaret Chen, a stern woman with 30 years of experience in family law, had cleared her docket for this special hearing, the final custody determination for Emma Grace Sullivan. The little girl who had captured the nation's heart with her courage was about to learn where she would spend the rest of her childhood. Emma sat in the front row between Dr. Sarah Martinez and Dorothy May, wearing a pale yellow dress that Dorothy had bought specially for the occasion. At 6 years old, she understood that today would decide whether she could finally go home with her soldier or if the grown-ups would send her to live with strangers again. Her small hands clutched a folded piece of paper, a new drawing she had made the night before. Mick entered the courtroom on crutches, his left leg still weak from the surgeries, but his back straight with military bearing. 6 weeks of separation from Emma had carved new lines into his face, but his eyes held the same protective love that had driven him to risk everything at the Sunset Motel. Behind him sat his sister Linda from Texas, who had driven 12 hours to testify on his behalf, and Dr. Robert Hayes, the VA psychiatrist who had been treating his PTSD. The hearing began with Patricia Hendricks presenting the state's findings. The social worker, who had aged years in the past 2 months, spoke with quiet conviction about the extraordinary circumstances of the case. Your Honor, after extensive investigation and psychological evaluation, the state's position has evolved significantly. While Mr. Harrison lacks traditional qualifications for adoption, the unique trauma bond between him and Emma, combined with the revelation of Thomas Sullivan's criminal activities, creates circumstances that require us to prioritize the child's psychological well-being over standard protocol. Judge Chen listened carefully as Dr. Martinez presented her findings. Emma has been in state custody for 8 weeks, Your Honor, during which time she has shown clear signs of deteriorating mental health. She has stopped eating regularly, stopped speaking in complete sentences, and has reverted to behaviors consistent with severe attachment disorder. However, when allowed supervised visits with Mr. Harrison over the past week, her improvement has been remarkable and immediate. The courtroom fell silent as Emma was called to testify. Judge Chen had arranged for the 6-year-old to speak privately in her chambers, but Emma had insisted on addressing the court directly, with Dr. Martinez by her side. She approached the witness stand with the quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout this ordeal. "Emma," Judge Chen said gently, "can you tell us what you want?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper, but every person in the courtroom strained to hear her words. "I want to go home with my soldier. Mick saved me from the bad men. He kept his promise to protect me." She unfolded her drawing and held it up, a picture of herself and Mick standing in front of a small house with a garden, both of them smiling. "I drew us a home. We can take care of each other." "What about other families, sweetheart? There are nice people who want to give you a home, too." Emma shook her head firmly. "Mick is my family now. When Grandpa Frank went to heaven, Mick became my daddy. Not because papers say so, but because love says so." Her words, wise beyond her years, brought tears to Dorothy May's eyes and caused several spectators to openly weep. Mick was called to testify next, and his voice was steady but emotional as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, I know I'm not the ideal candidate on paper. I'm a disabled veteran with PTSD, limited income, and no experience raising children. But Emma and I understand each other's pain in a way that can't be taught or learned from books. We both lost everything, and we've both survived things that should have broken us. I can give her what she needs most, someone who will never give up on her, never send her away, and never stop fighting for her safety and happiness." Linda Harrison took the stand to testify about Mick's character and her willingness to provide support and backup care. "My brother has always been a protector, Your Honor. Even as children, he stood up for those who couldn't defend themselves. What happened to him in Afghanistan broke something inside him, but saving Emma has given him back his purpose. I've never seen him more focused or determined than he's been these past weeks fighting for custody." The turning point came when Dorothy May was called to testify. The 65-year-old waitress, who had become an unlikely hero in Emma's story, spoke with the authority of someone who had witnessed the entire tragedy unfold. "Your Honor, I've been serving truck drivers and travelers for 30 years, and I've seen a lot of hurting people pass through my diner. But I've never seen love like what exists between that man and that little girl. They saved each other in every way that matters." Dr. Hayes, Mick's psychiatrist, provided crucial testimony about his patient's mental health. "Mr. Harrison has shown remarkable improvement since taking on the responsibility of fighting for Emma's custody. His PTSD symptoms have decreased significantly, his sense of purpose has returned, and his commitment to therapy and medication compliance has been exemplary. In my professional opinion, caring for Emma would be therapeutic for him while providing her with a guardian who truly understands trauma recovery." The prosecution's final argument came from Thomas Sullivan's expensive legal team, who had been fighting to delay proceedings while their client faced federal trafficking charges. His lead attorney made a desperate attempt to portray Mick as an unstable veteran whose PTSD made him dangerous to children. But the argument fell flat when Emma herself stood up in the gallery and spoke clearly for everyone to hear. "Mick isn't scary. He's brave. He saved me when nobody else would. He has sad dreams sometimes, just like me. But that's why we help each other feel better." Judge Chen called for a brief recess, during which Emma was allowed to approach Mick for the first time in the courtroom. Their reunion, witnessed by everyone present, provided the most powerful testimony of all. Emma ran to him despite his crutches, wrapping her small arms around his waist with desperate relief. Mick knelt carefully to her level, holding her as if she were made of precious glass. "I thought you forgot about me," Emma whispered against his chest. "Never," Mick replied, his voice breaking. "I will never forget you. Never stop fighting for you. Never stop loving you. You're my daughter now, Emma Grace. Nothing will ever change that." When court reconvened, Judge Chen delivered her decision with the weight of Solomon's wisdom. "This case has challenged every assumption I've held about what constitutes a suitable family environment. Traditional metrics suggest Mr. Harrison is not an ideal guardian. However, the extraordinary circumstances of this case, the clear trauma bond between child and guardian, the child's own expressed wishes, and the complete absence of any viable alternative force me to prioritize the child's emotional needs over institutional preferences." She paused, looking directly at Emma and Mick. "Emma Grace Sullivan, you have shown courage that adults twice your age couldn't muster. Michael Harrison, you have demonstrated a commitment to this child that goes beyond legal obligation to something approaching the sacred. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that Emma Grace Sullivan be placed in the permanent custody of Michael James Harrison, with adoption proceedings to begin immediately." The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration as Emma launched herself into Mick's arms again, this time with pure joy. Dorothy May dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief while Linda Harrison smiled through her tears. Even Patricia Hendricks, who had seen too many cases end badly, allowed herself a moment of happiness for a system that had finally gotten it right. As they left the courthouse together, Emma riding on Mick's shoulders despite his crutches, both of them laughing for the first time in months, the afternoon Arizona sun seemed brighter than it had in weeks. They were going home to a small apartment that Linda had helped Mick secure, to a life that would be simple, but filled with the most important thing either of them had ever possessed: a family chosen by love rather than blood, forged by shared trauma, and sealed by the unbreakable bond between a soldier who had found his purpose and a little girl who had never stopped believing in heroes. 6 months later, the small duplex on Maple Street in Tucson had become everything Emma had drawn in her courthouse picture and more. The front yard boasted a modest garden where she and Mick grew tomatoes and sunflowers, and the back porch held 2 rocking chairs where they sat every evening to watch the desert sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Emma had started 2nd grade at Roosevelt Elementary, where her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, marveled at her reading ability and gentle way with other children who seemed sad or scared. Mick had found work as a security consultant for a nonprofit organization that helped trafficking victims, using his military experience and personal understanding of trauma to create safe spaces for survivors. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest failure, surviving when his unit didn't, had become the foundation for his greatest success in protecting others. His PTSD symptoms hadn't disappeared, but they had become manageable with therapy, medication, and most importantly, the daily purpose of caring for Emma. Their morning routine had become sacred ritual. Emma would wake first, as she always had, but instead of lying in fearful silence, she would pad across the hall to Mick's room and climb into bed beside him. They would plan their day together, what she would learn at school, what he would accomplish at work, and what adventure they might have in the evening. Sometimes they would visit Dorothy May at her new job at the truck stop diner across town, where she had become something of a local celebrity for her role in breaking up the trafficking ring. Emma's healing had been remarkable, but not without setbacks. She still had nightmares about the motel, still flinched when strangers approached too quickly, and still carried her inhaler everywhere even though her asthma had improved significantly. but she had also regained her voice, her laughter, and her faith in the goodness of people. She attended Sunday school at the little Baptist church down the street, where she had shocked the congregation by volunteering to pray for all the children who don't have soldiers to protect them. The trafficking ring that had targeted her had been completely dismantled. Thomas Sullivan was serving a life sentence in federal prison, and 14 other members of his organization had been convicted on various charges. Miguel Santos, the man who had shot Frank, was facing the death penalty in Arizona. The investigation had led to the rescue of 23 other children who had been trafficked through the network, and Emma had become the face of a national campaign to reform how Child Protective Services handled trauma cases. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationships they had built. Linda Harrison visited every month from Texas, bringing her own children to play with Emma and providing the extended family support that made their unconventional arrangement work. Dr. Martinez continued seeing Emma for therapy, but their sessions had evolved from crisis intervention to normal childhood counseling about school friendships and growing up. Maria Santos, the woman who had helped shield Emma during the motel rescue, had become like a grandmother to her. Maria's own children, now Emma's closest friends, spent every Saturday at the Maple Street house, filling it with the sound of bilingual chatter and children's laughter. Big Jim Thompson stopped by whenever his trucking routes brought him through Tucson, always bearing gifts and stories from the road. The legal adoption had been finalized in January, with Emma choosing to keep her mother's surname while adding Harrison as her middle name, Emma Grace Sullivan Harrison. The ceremony had been small but perfect, held in Judge Chen's chambers with only their chosen family present. When the judge asked Emma if she understood what adoption meant, the 7-year-old had responded with typical wisdom. "It means Mick promises to be my daddy forever, and I promise to be his daughter forever, and nobody can ever break that promise." Dorothy May had been there too, of course. The woman who had first recognized Emma's distress signals and had refused to look away when action was needed had become their honorary grandmother. She had moved to Tucson to be closer to them, taking a job at a local diner where she continued her informal mission of watching out for travelers who might need help. The community they had built extended beyond their immediate circle. Mick's work with trafficking survivors had introduced them to other families who had faced similar traumas, creating a support network of people who understood that healing was possible but never simple. Emma had become a source of hope for other rescued children, showing them through her own recovery that trust could be rebuilt and happiness could return. Their evenings were filled with the ordinary magic of family life. Emma would do her homework at the kitchen table while Mick prepared dinner, usually simple meals that accommodated both his basic cooking skills and her still sensitive appetite. After dinner, they would read together on the living room couch, working their way through chapter books that challenged Emma's advanced reading skills while providing escape into worlds where heroes always won and children were always safe. Bedtime remained the most sacred part of their routine. Mick would sit on the edge of Emma's bed while she said her prayers, which always included gratitude for her soldier daddy and requests for protection for other children in danger. Then he would tell her stories, sometimes about his childhood, sometimes about his military service, carefully edited for age appropriateness, and sometimes about their future adventures together. "Daddy Mick," Emma said one evening in May, using the name she had settled on after trying various combinations, "do you think Mama and Grandpa Frank can see us from heaven?" Mick considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all of Emma's theological inquiries. "I think they can, sweetheart, and I think they're proud of how brave and kind you've become. Do you think they're sorry about what happened? I think your Grandpa Frank is very sorry about the mistakes he made, but very happy that you're safe and loved now. And I think your Mama is grateful that you found a family who will never let anyone hurt you again." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I forgive Grandpa Frank. Jesus says, We have to forgive people who are sorry. But I'm still glad he can't make bad choices anymore. These conversations, wise beyond her years but age-appropriate in their fundamental trust, reminded Mick daily of why he had been willing to risk everything for this child. Emma had taught him that heroism wasn't about the dramatic moments of combat, but about the daily choice to show up, to protect, to love unconditionally, even when it was difficult. The transformation in Mick himself had been equally profound. The guilt that had consumed him since Afghanistan hadn't disappeared, but it had been recontextualized. His survival meant Emma's survival. His training meant her protection. His understanding of trauma meant her healing. The losses that had once seemed meaningless now served a purpose larger than himself. On a warm Saturday evening in June, exactly 1 year after their first meeting at the Desert Rose Rest Stop, Mick and Emma sat in their rocking chairs watching the sunset. Emma was reading aloud from a book about a brave little girl who saved her village from dragons, her voice confident and clear. Mick listened with the contentment of a man who had finally found his place in the world. "Daddy Mick," Emma said, closing the book and looking at him with eyes that still held depths but now sparkled with happiness, "I'm glad Jesus sent you to be my soldier." "I'm glad Jesus sent you to be my daughter," Mick replied, reaching over to squeeze her small hand. "You saved me just as much as I saved you." As the desert sky faded from orange to purple to star-filled black, they sat together in comfortable silence, two survivors who had found healing in the most unlikely place, in each other's love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and heal and help others, but tonight they were simply a father and daughter grateful for the miracle of their chosen family. The little girl who had once traced desperate SOS signals in water droplets now traced letters in the air as she practiced spelling words for Monday's test. And the soldier who had once lost faith in his ability to protect anyone now slept peacefully each night, knowing that the most important mission of his life was succeeding beyond his wildest dreams. Their story had become a testament to the truth that families are built not just by blood or law, but by love, sacrifice, and the courage to fight for what matters most. In a world that often seemed dark and dangerous, Emma and Mick had created a light that would continue to shine for generations to come. Sometimes the greatest victories come not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments of a child's laughter, in the security of unconditional love, and in the knowledge that even the most broken hearts can be made whole again when they find their true home. Message for American seniors, 200 words. This story reminds us of a time when neighbors looked out for each other, when a handshake meant something, and when ordinary people stepped up to do extraordinary things. Emma and Mick's journey speaks to those of us who remember when communities were built on shared values of protecting the innocent and standing up for what's right. We've lived through decades of change, watched families scatter, and sometimes wondered if the world has lost its moral compass. But stories like this prove that courage, faith, and genuine love still triumph over evil. Whether you're a grandparent worried about today's dangers, a veteran seeking purpose, or someone who believes in the power of chosen family, Emma's rescue reminds us that heroes don't wear capes. They wear work boots, aprons, and sometimes carry the invisible wounds of service. Her story honors the generation that taught us right from wrong and shows that simple human decency can still change lives. In an age of complexity, sometimes the most profound truths are found in a child's trust and an adult's willingness to protect the innocent at any cost. Questions for comments. Have you ever witnessed a situation where you wish you had spoken up to help a child or vulnerable person? What memories from your own childhood remind you of the importance of community members watching out for each other? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.